Before we begin, please leave a comment, share your thoughts and let us know your lessons learned in the comment section below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Lila was just 12 years old when her world was torn apart. In the small, quiet village of Harrowbrook, where every face was familiar and the rhythms of life moved at a slow, predictable pace, she had always known peace. Her mother, Amara, was the heart of their little family, kind, loving, and gentle. She had always protected Lila from the world's cruelties, her soft voice offering comfort and her embrace a safe haven. Their life was simple, yet perfect, but that peace shattered one rainy season. It started with the smallest of signs. Amara had become unusually tired, her energy slipping away faster than usual. At first, Lila brushed it off, thinking her mother was simply exhausted from the long hours of work she did to provide for them. But day by day, Amara grew weaker, her once bright smile replaced by an unspoken sadness. Lila didn't understand it then, but the illness that gripped her mother had no mercy. One day, after weeks of watching her mother struggle, Lila woke up to an empty room. Her heart skipped a beat as she rushed to her mother's side. But it was too late. Amara had passed away in her sleep, her body cold and still. Lila couldn't understand what had happened. How could the woman who had given her life, the woman who had filled their home with warmth and love, be gone so suddenly? She tried to call for help, but no one was there. The house, once filled with the gentle hum of life, was now eerily quiet. Her father, a quiet man named Edgar, seemed to crumble as well. The light in his eyes dimmed, and his once strong presence became a shadow of what it had been. The grief was too much for him to bear. Edgar didn't know how to comfort his daughter or himself. He simply sat in silence, staring at the ground as if hoping the world would stop spinning. The funeral was a blur of muted colors and whispered prayers, and it felt like the earth beneath Lila's feet had disappeared. After the funeral, Edgar retreated into himself, consumed by the grief of losing his wife. Lila, too, felt her world come to a screeching halt. The two of them wandered through the days, lost in their sorrow. Their once warm home now felt cold and empty, filled with silence that echoed through the halls. Lila missed her mother more than anything, her soothing words, her gentle laughter, the way she made everything feel safe. A year passed, but the pain never truly went away. Lila's father, though still mourning, began to talk about moving on, about finding someone who could help fill the void left by Amara. He wasn't the same man. The joy had drained from him, replaced by a quiet desperation that Lila could sense but didn't fully understand. But then, one day, Edgar announced that he was getting remarried. Lila was too shocked to speak. Her father had fallen in love again. But this time, it wasn't with a woman like her mother, gentle, loving, and warm. No, this woman, Evelyn, was different. She was everything that Amara had not been. Cold, distant, and calculating. Evelyn seemed to have a presence that could freeze the air in a room. Yet, her father seemed to think this would be the answer. He believed that Evelyn would bring stability, that she would help raise Lila and provide her the maternal love she needed. He didn't see the warning signs. And Lila, still reeling from the loss of her mother, was too numb to protest. When Evelyn first stepped into their home, she wore a smile that was too perfect to be real. She spoke to Lila with soft, almost saccharine tones, as though she were a stranger who had known her forever. "Oh, Lila, darling, I've heard so much about you," she said, her voice high and sweet, yet with an edge that Lila couldn't place. Evelyn bent down to Lila's level and patted her head like a child, as if she were trying to pretend she belonged. But Lila, always perceptive, felt a chill in her touch. There was something off about this woman, something that made Lila's skin crawl. She wanted to believe in the kindness Evelyn pretended to show, but a small, quiet voice inside her warned her that things were about to change. At first, the changes were subtle. Evelyn rearranged the furniture, as if it were her right to take control of everything. And slowly, she began to assume the role of head of the household. Her presence in the house was commanding, and her demands were unrelenting. She moved into Amara's old room, the room that Lila had spent so many hours in with her mother, and began to act as though it had always been hers. Lila tried to adjust, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the house she had known and loved was no longer her own. Then the real torment began. One morning, as the sun had barely begun to rise, Lila was woken by Evelyn's sharp, demanding voice. "Lila," she called. "Where is my robe?" Lila, still groggy from sleep, ran into the room, confused and unsure of what Evelyn meant. "I don't know, madam," she said, her voice trembling. Evelyn's eyes blazed with fury. "You're useless," she spat. "I left it on my bed and now I can't find it. Are you trying to make my life harder?" Before Lila could explain, Evelyn slapped her across the face so hard that Lila's head spun. Her cheek burned, but she fought back the tears, her body trembling in shock. From that moment, things spiraled downward. Every day, Lila was forced to wake up at the crack of dawn to clean, cook, and serve Evelyn and her daughter, Isha, even though there were other people in the house who could help. Evelyn insisted that Lila do everything herself. Lila was treated like a servant in her own home, and no matter how hard she worked, there was never any recognition. The food she prepared was often thrown away, and she was left hungry, while Evelyn and Isha ate to their heart's content. Meanwhile, her father, who had once been her protector, said nothing. He simply sat quietly, as if he didn't care about her pain. He had remarried, and in his eyes, Lila was just another responsibility, one that he could no longer bear to focus on. Lila didn't know how much more she could take. She missed her mother every single day, and as the abuse grew worse, she began to pray for an escape. But escape didn't seem possible. The life she once knew had been replaced by a nightmare, and she was trapped in a house that no longer felt like home. Lila's life under Evelyn's cruel rule grew more unbearable with each passing day. The house, once filled with laughter and love, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on her as she navigated the daily horrors of her existence. She woke early every morning to start the day with chores, sweeping the compound, washing the clothes, and cooking meals that were rarely appreciated. Even the most basic tasks felt like mountains to climb under Evelyn's constant criticism. Lila could never do anything right in her stepmother's eyes. Every time she prepared a meal, Evelyn would scrutinize it, finding something to complain about. If the soup was too salty, Lila would be punished. If the rice was slightly overcooked, she would be scolded. The house was always in chaos, with Evelyn's sharp voice echoing through every room. The woman never let Lila rest. There was always something to be done, and if it wasn't done perfectly, it would result in a new punishment. Yet the most painful part of all was that her father, Edgar, seemed completely blind to it all. Lila would cry herself to sleep at night, her heart aching with the knowledge that the one person she had hoped would protect her had become nothing more than a shadow of himself. Her father, once a strong and loving man, was now a hollow figure, broken by grief and too emotionally distant to see the suffering his daughter was enduring. He would offer her no comfort, no words of encouragement. Instead, he simply told her to obey Evelyn. "She's your mother now, Lila," he would say, his voice flat and resigned. "You must listen to her." Each time he spoke those words, Lila felt her heart break just a little more. How could her father call this woman her mother? How could he ask her to accept the person who had stolen her home, her warmth, and her safety? Lila's mind raced with the thought that her father no longer cared for her as he once had. She began to question whether he ever truly had. But Evelyn's tyranny was not just limited to verbal abuse. It quickly became physical as well. One day, after Lila had spent the whole morning scrubbing the floors, Evelyn came into the room, her eyes filled with cold fury. "Lila," she snapped, her voice cutting through the silence. "Why is the house still not clean?" Lila, exhausted and worn out, could barely muster the strength to answer. She had done everything Evelyn had asked, yet it was never enough. "You are useless," Evelyn spat, stepping forward and slapping Lila across the face. The sting of the blow sent a sharp pain through Lila's cheek. But it was nothing compared to the emotional pain that followed. Evelyn's handprint burned on her skin, a cruel reminder of how little she mattered. From that day forward, Lila's life became a constant cycle of fear and humiliation. She was forced to cook, clean, and serve Evelyn and her daughter, Isha. No matter how hard she worked, there was always something more to be done. She had become a servant in her own home, and it seemed that there was no escape from the constant torment. Even the simplest of joys, such as eating a meal, were denied to her. She often went to bed hungry, as Evelyn and Isha consumed everything, leaving little to nothing for Lila. The few scraps she was given were cold and tasteless. And still, Evelyn criticized her cooking. Her father, Edgar, remained a silent witness to it all. His heart had been broken by the loss of his wife. But now it seemed that his indifference to Lila's suffering was even worse. He had shut himself off from the world, retreating into his own grief and not noticing that his daughter was slipping away from him. The situation grew even worse when Evelyn began to openly favor Isha, treating her like a queen while forcing Lila to do all the hard work. Isha was spoiled and lazy, never once lifting a finger to help with anything. She would sit around, eating, chatting, and laughing, while Lila slaved away in the kitchen. Sometimes, when Lila was in the middle of a chore, Isha would walk into the room, sniff the air, and sneer. "This food is disgusting," Isha would say, making Lila feel even more worthless. One evening, as Lila was preparing a simple soup, Isha walked in, took a bite, and immediately spat it out onto the floor. "This is revolting. What did you even put in this?" she jeered. Evelyn's voice rang out from the other room. "Lila, what is this nonsense you've cooked?" Before Lila could even respond, Evelyn marched into the kitchen and slapped her hard across the face. "You think you can cook? You can't even make soup properly. From now on, you won't eat until your food is perfect," Evelyn declared coldly. Lila was left standing there, tears welling up in her eyes, her face stinging from the slap. But she held her tears in check. She wouldn't give Evelyn the satisfaction of seeing her break. She refused to let the woman see how much she was suffering, how much it hurt her to be treated as if she were nothing more than a servant in her own home. Despite the constant abuse, Lila never stopped hoping for a way out. She dreamed of running away, of escaping to a place where she could be free from the constant torment, free from the cruel woman who had invaded her life. But she had no idea where to go, no place to turn. The world outside seemed just as dark and unforgiving as the prison Evelyn had created for her. Then, one fateful evening, a new development sent shockwaves through Lila's world. Evelyn announced that she had arranged a marriage for Lila. Lila was just 18, barely a woman, yet her stepmother had already decided her fate. The man she would marry was none other than Mr. Okafo, a bus driver nearly twice her age. Evelyn spoke of him with a twisted sense of pride, as though he were some kind of prize that Lila should be grateful for. "You'll marry him, and your life will be much better than it is now," Evelyn told her coldly. "He will take care of you." Lila's heart dropped. She didn't want to marry this man. She didn't want to marry anyone, let alone a man old enough to be her father. But she knew she had no choice. Evelyn's grip on her life was unshakable. And her father, once the man who promised to protect her, said nothing. He just nodded in silence, as though resigning himself to the inevitable. On the eve of the wedding, Lila sat alone in her room, her heart heavy with dread. She wanted to scream, to shout, to tell the world that this wasn't right. But she was powerless. She had been trapped in this nightmare for too long. As she lay on her small bed, tears streaming down her face, she whispered a silent prayer, one last plea for freedom, for a way out. But she had no idea that her life was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. The day of Lila's wedding dawned cold and gray, as if the skies themselves were mourning her fate. She woke to the sound of Evelyn's sharp voice calling her from downstairs. But Lila could barely move. Her heart weighed heavy in her chest, each beat a reminder of the life she was about to lose. The walls of her small room felt suffocating, and for a moment, she wondered if she could somehow escape, run far away and never look back. But she knew she couldn't. The doors were locked, and Evelyn was watching her every move. The wedding preparations had been rushed, hurried, and cold. There was no joy in the air, no excitement, just an overwhelming sense of dread. Evelyn had insisted on every detail, forcing Lila to wear a simple, drab dress that made her feel like a doll, lifeless and devoid of any hope for the future. She had been dressed, made up, and was led to the village square, where the ceremony would take place. Her hands trembled as she clutched the wooden cup filled with palm wine, a symbol of the tradition that demanded she offer it to her new husband. The village square was packed with people, their whispers and stares sending chills down her spine. Lila felt as if she were walking through a dream, every step heavier than the last. The crowd was not there to celebrate her, but to gawk at her misfortune. She was being sold to a man who was nearly twice her age. Someone who could have been her father. Mr. Okafo, the old bus driver, stood at the center of the square, his hands shaking with anticipation. his breath heavy and labored as if the weight of the world had already descended upon him. Lila's stomach twisted as she approached him, knowing that this man would be her life for the rest of her days. She had no choice but to go through with it. Her legs felt like lead as she walked toward him, her gaze never lifting from the ground. The villagers cheered, their voices a cacophony of mockery and judgment. Lila's heart beat faster, her pulse rising as she reached Mr. Okafo. She forced herself to kneel, offering him the cup. His fingers, cold and rough, closed around the drink as he smiled, an ugly, twisted grin that made Lila's stomach turn. "Drink, my dear," he rasped, his voice coarse with age. "We are married now." The words struck her like a hammer. She was no longer Lila, the girl who had dreams, hopes, and desires. She was now Mrs. Okafo, a young girl trapped in a life of misery. But even as her soul screamed for freedom, she did the one thing she had learned to do all her life: she obeyed. She watched as Mr. Okafo took a long swig from the cup. And then she was led away, her hands still shaking, her heart still heavy. That night, when they arrived at Mr. Okafo's house, Lila couldn't believe her eyes. What she had expected, a small, dark, and shabby dwelling, was nothing like the reality she faced. Mr. Okafo's home was old and weathered, with a broken fence and a rickety wooden door. The smell of damp wood and decay filled the air, and Lila could hardly bear to step inside. It was far from the life she had imagined for herself. But as she stood there, her hands trembling, something unexpected happened, something she could not have foreseen. "Come in, my dear," Mr. Okafo said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. But Lila remained frozen in the doorway. This was not the life she had dreamed of. This wasn't a home, it was a prison. One that she had been forced into by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Just as she was about to step inside, something extraordinary happened. The sound of a sleek black car pulling up to the compound broke the silence. Lila turned toward the driveway in confusion. She had never seen such a car in the village before, especially not in a place like this. The car doors opened, and out stepped a young man, no older than 25. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his movements confident and controlled. Lila blinked in disbelief. Who was this person? What was he doing here? As if reading her mind, Mr. Okafo chuckled. "This is my driver, Hugo," he said casually. "He'll be looking after you." The young man, Hugo, gave her a polite smile, though it was clear that he was trying to hide his discomfort. "Good evening, madam," he said with a slight bow. His voice was smooth, like honey, and Lila couldn't help but feel a strange sense of recognition in his gaze. There was something about him that made her feel a flicker of hope, something she hadn't felt in years. But before she could say anything, another car arrived, followed by another, until there were 5 sleek black vehicles parked in front of the small house. Lila stood there, her mind racing. What was going on? This was not what she had imagined. This was not what she had been told. Then, as the cars came to a stop, men in fine suits stepped out, their presence commanding the attention of everyone around them. Mr. Okafo clapped his hands together, his face beaming with pride. "This is where the real story begins," he said. "I am not just a poor bus driver, Lila. I am a billionaire." The words hit Lila like a tidal wave. A billionaire? But he was supposed to be poor. The old man who had been sent to marry her, everything she had been told, everything she had believed, was a lie. As Mr. Okafo led her into the house, the transformation was beyond anything Lila could have imagined. The modest, dilapidated home suddenly turned into a mansion, luxurious and grand, with marble floors and gold-framed paintings on the walls. Servants moved about the place, bringing in trays of expensive wines and food. Lila's mind raced, trying to process everything. How could this be? What had happened to the man who had pretended to be poor? "I wanted to test people," Mr. Okafo said with a wicked smile. As they walked through the mansion, "I let everyone think I was poor, old, and helpless. But the truth is, I built an empire from the ground up. And now, I have everything I could ever want." As Lila stood there, speechless, Mr. Okafo continued, his voice filled with amusement. "Your stepmother, Evelyn, was the first to fall for my little game. She sent you to me, thinking I was a poor old man. She didn't know that I was one of the richest men in the land." Lila's heart pounded in her chest as the truth began to sink in. Evelyn had sold her to a billionaire. The woman who had tormented her, who had forced her into this marriage, had no idea what she had just done. And Lila realized, in that moment, that her stepmother's greed had blinded her to everything else. She had sent her daughter to the man she thought was poor. But in reality, she had married her off to someone far more powerful than she could have ever imagined. The next day, the villagers began to gossip. Word spread quickly that Chief Okafo was not the poor bus driver everyone had believed him to be. He was a billionaire. The news sent shockwaves through the village. And Evelyn's smug smile quickly turned to ash. 2 days later, Evelyn arrived at the mansion, her face pale with disbelief. She had come to see for herself. But what she saw was beyond anything she could have imagined. As she stood there, frozen in shock, Lila stepped forward with a calm smile. "Stepmother," she said softly, her voice steady, "you sent me to the richest man in the land. And now, here I am." Evelyn's face drained of color. She had no words, only the weight of her own mistakes crushing her. She had tried to destroy Lila. But in the end, it was her own greed that had destroyed her. As Lila turned to leave the mansion, walking away from the woman who had made her life a living hell, she realized that her story was far from over. She had found her freedom. But she had done so on her own terms. No one could control her anymore. With a final glance at the woman who had tormented her for so long, Lila turned her back and walked into the future. Knowing that nothing would ever be the same again, she was free. And for the first time in years, she felt truly alive.